All right, welcome everyone to this month's EdTech chat. Hope you all are doing well. My name is Michael Vaughn. I'm joined by Amy Tessitore, and welcome to this month's edition of EdTech Chats with Open LMS. Today, Amy and I are chatting about our favorite strategies and techniques that instructors can use to boost learner engagement, especially in online environments, and especially within the learning management system. So, with instructor and student intention pretty much facing extraordinary demands at this point, it's essential for instructors to find ways to keep their learners actively engaged and interested in what's going on, and excited about learning in general. So, by the end of our chat, Amy and I are hoping you'll have a better understanding of how to create enjoyable and engaging online learning experiences for others, as well as how to build a strong sense of community, collaboration, and curiosity among your learners. So, I think a good place to get started is just acknowledging that engagement is a really tricky subject because you brought up a really great example when you and I were talking the other day, Amy, where, if we're talking and I'm like nodding my head and going, I might look engaged, but I might be thinking about something else entirely. So I'm not actually engaged. So I think a really great starting point would be the question, what is engagement? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think that's a really important place to start, and I think that it's really important to remember that how we gauge engagement face to face versus online is a little bit different. Like you just said, I could be looking you dead in the face, nodding and appearing to interact, but actually not hearing a single word that you're saying. So, engagement is really the degree to which students display attention, but also curiosity, interest, optimism, and passion.
Mm.
And that's the thing. It's not just the interest. It's not just looking at you and nodding my head, but am I curious about the topic? Am I showing some interest? Am I asking questions that would indicate that I want to learn more? Am I optimistic or am I pessimistic about being there and learning this thing? And one of the things to keep in mind is that engagement really does lead to differences in performance. So the more engaged someone is with something, the higher their level of performance and achievement when they display those levels of engagement. And I think that if we think about that in terms of not just education, but we think about it in terms of our job, when we're really engaged with what we're doing, we're producing at a much higher level, a higher standard. We're able to get through things. We're thinking in an innovative way. We're trying to bring things forward. And we know when people are not engaged at work. And so very similar in the classroom, when your students are disengaged, but I think the key there is understanding that engagement is really a four-piece thing. It's that attention, the curiosity, um, the interest in the optimism, and then also that passion for learning.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic starting point. I love that curiosity in particular because I know this isn't directly related to teaching and learning, but one of the things I sometimes talk about with others is like interpersonal relationships and what does an engaged or a disengaged partner look like. And that curiosity piece is really important there because like if you're in a relationship and your partner's not curious about you, like that tends to lead to disengagement, right? And I think the same thing applies
Yes.
in those educational environments. It's really kind of interesting how much blending there can be between our professional slash educational environments and even our personal lives within there. So I love that multifaceted approach that you've got to engagement.
Mhm.
That's really, really cool. I think that's probably a good lead in to talk about like what are some ways that folks in learning and development or teaching and learning can use to actively engage their learners in the process of actually learning. And there are some things that I really love. So if you don't mind me jumping in,
Yeah, no,
I
please.
love incorporating multimedia. I really do. Even when we try and incorporate like different types of files, it ends up usually being pretty text heavy, right? Like people will post their slides, and those slides are usually text heavy, or if they incorporate images, they might not be highly relevant images or images that are used really well. And that text can be pretty overwhelming. I mean, yes, when we read books, we read a lot of text, right? Like that's essentially how it works. But we're also making a choice when we read a book to read a lot of text. And when we're in a course, when we're in a learning experience, our expectations might be a little bit different because there are multiple forms of media out there. There are multiple ways that we engage with information in our own world, right? How many of us check social media on a regular basis to see how our friends and the people that we choose to follow are doing or what they're up to or what information they're sharing. We live in a hyper visual society, a hyper multimedia society. So just sticking with text is usually not that engaging, if we're being honest. So being able to incorporate multimedia into the courses, I think it diversifies your content sources and what's available, because there might be a really fantastic podcast that deals with what you're talking about. There might be an excellent video, but it even plays into, I think, that concept that we sometimes talk about, like multisensory memory. And just to dramatically oversimplify this in a way that would make neuroscientists mad at me, that idea that the more senses you're activating at a given moment, the more likely you are to form a memory that's easier to recall later. And I sometimes see a joke about this. It's like, do you ever smell the air and suddenly it's a crisp, cool October day and you're in 4th grade at the Scholastic Book Fair? And it's just like that sort of thing, because all those senses were activated when that memory was created. And so it's easier to recall later. So when we're activating our learner senses on multiple levels, that's certainly something that helps with memory formation from just a basic neuroscience perspective. But I think it also gives you an opportunity to break up content in a course.
Mhm.
Right? Like, how many times do we do a presentation? We might break it up by using a video or maybe dissecting an image or a diagram or something like that. So it's a really cool tool, I think, for instructors to use to not just diversify their content, but to break it up into meaningful chunks so that the learners can then engage with those chunks in a more meaningful way, in a way that's a bit more attainable for them, especially if they're in a lifestyle where they have to stop and start a lot with their education as they're engaging with it. I know that's
Yeah.
something we try and do in the academy courses as well.
It is. And, I think that if we all think back to our life being students, there is probably some song that we learned somewhere along the way. So, and we will never forget, the thing that we were trying to learn for that. Right. And that's a good example of how when we engage different parts of the brain in learning, it actually leads to better retention of information, but it also helps us to form connections. And the reason that that matters is not just the connection to the crisp, clear October morning at the Scholastic Book Fair, but all of the other things that were tied to that. So now we start to form associations between lived experiences, information, and other information. And that's really when we start to engage people, we really are engaging multisensory here. And that does help people to form those long-term connections between a variety of information experiences and also triggers that curiosity.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And I and if we're being honest, some things are just better explained through multimedia. Like, I'll share my screen for a hot second in here. Um, let's see if it will be okay with me doing that. Because I have like this GIF, and this is one of the things that I talked about whenever I do a presentation design presentation or training, and it's that sometimes things are just better explained with a visual aid. And one of the things I use as an example is, if you watch a sewing machine work, it looks like magic, because there's this needle with thread, it pokes the fabric, it comes back out, there's a stitch there, and it makes no sense at all if you are looking at that as an outsider. And it's only when I started showing folks this diagram that there's a lot of stuff going on underneath that layer of fabric that actually completes and forms that stitch. So they don't realize that there's actually more thread involved there. It's not just like a single thread coming from this needle at the very top. And that's the general idea there. Like, it's very, very hard to explain this entire process through text, but being able to watch it over and over and over again makes it a pretty complex issue, pretty complex description, something that's much more attainable and easily taken in. And not only that, it's just interesting, right? It's interesting.
Yeah.
It feels like a little win to get this complex topic in such a fast way. So,
Mhm.
and it's not just, I would say it's not just like multimedia on its own. It goes to some of the things that you were talking about, where if you can have those constructive interruptions, I think we call them, with content where you can jump in and say, did you understand what you just saw? Like, here's a quick little assessment, because we know that, we talk about memory formation, but you also talk about things that promote learning, like, quizzing, recall practice,
Mhm.
right? Those short form quizzes, even dropping in a question or two, like we would do in a live presentation if we were doing a live training, Those are things that help the learners practice that recall and form a stronger memory so that they can actually remember the content that they're trying to learn in that given moment. And taking that multimedia, you can now use stuff like H5P to just add these cool little interactive elements over top of it. I know one of the ones that you do really well is interactive video in H5P. And for the folks who haven't seen this just yet, it lets you take your own video and add these little stop and starting points in there where the learners have to answer a question before they can move forward in the video. And it's just a simple way to check and make sure that they understand the content before they move forward, but it's also for the learners' benefit because they get to make sure that they're actually learning what they're intending to be learning along the way. And it sort of breaks up that attention for a moment and says, hey, pause, let's make sure we know where we are, and then re-engage. And just I think that action of having to interact with the video, even in a relatively small way, is something that extends the level of engagement with the course because it's a literal physical interaction with what's going on, which is really hard to do in an online environment. But I know it sounds a little silly to say that, but it does feel like a physical interaction when you have to stop and like interact with this content that's now talking back to you. I think that's really
Right.
interesting.
Yeah, and I think, you hit on an important point here, which is that feeling like you're interacting with someone or something. With H5P, we absolutely can feel like we're having a real-time interaction with something. So we remove that passiveness, that passive learning that often comes from videos where we sit and we watch, or we become disengaged or distracted and we don't come back to it because now there's something to hold our attention. But it does speak to another aspect, which kind of hits on something that Paula in our comments is asking, where she asked for the cure for structured online discussions, which is how do we actually get collaborative learning going on? How do we get people collaborating? Because that collaboration does lead to learning. And as someone who, for those who know me, the least favorite thing in grad school was doing group projects, in part because, if you are someone who is a high achiever and you want that A, you tend to be a control freak about these. However, when we actually create a collaborative experience in our classes, particularly our online courses, we not only give people that opportunity to engage with others, they have an opportunity to engage with the content, and they have an opportunity to start to see things through a different lens because they're seeing how other learners see things. And our courses are overwhelmingly kind of designed where we are creating the content and putting it out there for the students. Sometimes we create courses where we get students to collaborate on things like creating quiz questions, or we ask students to submit the discussion prompts, which is another way to get away from that very kind of rote and structured weekly format for our forums when we ask our learners to start contributing to these. Another thing we can do, though, is start to focus on the student piece. So this is where students are directly engaging and directly creating content that they are using to teach one another. And this can be things like you're a teacher for one lesson, you get 15 minutes to talk about this topic, and students are actually creating that information and putting it forward, or they're creating a pamphlet or a study guide, or we're asking them to make a short form video that they put out there. But more than that, we can start to engage them with things like workshops, or one of the tools in Moodle that we really like is the wiki activity, because we can create this workspace where students can asynchronously put their ideas out there and talk about them and respond to one another. And that's really helpful when you are not all online at the same time. Helps you to feel like there's some level of presence going on, that you're engaging with people directly. They're reading and hearing and seeing your ideas and giving you actual feedback on them. And I think the key there is that when we want our learners to feel engaged through collaborative activities, we as the
Mhm.
teacher and instructor actually have to step back out of those. One of the fatal flaws in forums is that we often, as teachers, are told that we must be in there and post a response to every single initial response by Wednesday evening and then post something by Friday. And what happens is we end up directing the conversation that way, instead of letting that form more naturally. But when we do things like Wiki or the workshop, we actually take a step back and we let the students show us what they know and engage with one another in a way that we actually can't necessarily engage with students. One, because the hierarchy of roles sometimes doesn't allow it, but two, we're always trying to teach, right? That's who we are and that's what we do. So um, doing that type of collaborative learning, or as Rachel just referred to it in the comments, team based learning is really important, especially as she mentioned in graduate programs where you are almost always completely asynchronous, never meeting the people that you're working with, but actually need to have a pretty strong intellectual bond. And social emotional bond, because you're kind of all in it together. So I think that, when we talk about collaboration, the big key pieces here are stepping back as the teacher, not feeling like you have to drive all of the discussion, providing opportunities for student to student teaching and learning, where students are presenting the information versus you always presenting it from your lens. Being there to make sure that there are the structures, there are the activities for people to engage in, things like workshop activities, allowing students to collaborate and create what the assessment guide would be for a course. That works a little better in undergrad than in grad. But creating those activities really does help students to feel engaged and continue their long-term engagement, because now they've got some skin in the game. There's a reason, right? They benefit from being there and working together. And I think when we talk about, how do we engage, we talk about videos and how those create that feeling like you're there, that feeling of presence, that feeling like you're engaging with something. And that collaborative learning does pretty much, the same. We can do it in a variety of different ways. And I think those things are important. But I also think, one of the things, Michael, you and I were talking about is these are great ideas, but your expectations have to be very clear, not just for those activities, but overall when we want learners to engage. And I know that you had some really interesting thoughts on how we can communicate expectations and what we should be doing when it comes to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think when it comes to communicating expectations, it's essential for the learners. They do need some level of structure and accountability in a system, right? We do the same thing in businesses and schools, right? When we onboard staff, we have our own customs and norms and culture, and there's a structure for how things are done, and there are accountability systems for when people do really well or when they mess up. And the same needs to be true in online environments, especially when you're trying to create engaging learning experiences using some of those multiple domains that you were talking about. And if we were looking at, forum discussions or team-based learning, as Rachel had mentioned, when you interact with others, especially when you have students who are learning to interact with others in constructive and meaningful ways, and I'll be honest, there are plenty of adults who haven't quite mastered the skill either, right? And so we get to a point where there does need to be some sort of structure and accountability system in there, and I think one of the hard parts is how do you balance that, because you don't want to be overly prescriptive. But at the same time, if you ask the students to write a paper, so that's student to instructor interaction, how long is that paper? How should it be formatted? Do they need sources? How many sources do they need? Like, what are the questions that might keep them from being successful or making progress or being able to successfully engage with the content in that case? It's sort of like writing a sonnet, right? There are specific
Mhm.
rules to a sonnet, but knowing those rules creates a framework where it's possible to create something really beautiful because you have clearly defined roles and expectations within that sort of a project. I think it's an interesting balance because, I totally agree with what you're saying, Amy, where you don't want to jump into online forums and take over the discussion, because then the learners are trying to figure out, how do I post something that makes the teacher happy, rather
Right.
than how do I meaningfully
Mhm.
engage with another person in this course with a different perspective. But it is still possible for the instructor to create an environment that is both safe and comfortable and constructive for those sorts of conversations. Like, maybe there's a basic
Mhm.
don't be a jerk rule, or I'm gonna have to temporarily pause your permissions for being able to participate in this conversation.
Mhm.
And even simple things like that. So clearly communicating those expectations, I think, provides a level of comfort and answers a lot of pre-existing questions for learners, so that they can focus on what you want them to focus on, which is engaging with the course content, engaging with you, and engaging with each other.
Mhm.
So I'm a big believer in making sure that things are as clear as possible without being overly prescriptive, if you can help it.
Yeah, and I think, when you're in the position where you're putting that information out there, sharing those expectations, part of what you can do is think about where have questions about expectations come up in the past, and be, creating kind of a source document where you've got kind of an FAQ related to these types of things. So, um, I think that if you start to craft that over time, you can end up with a very clear list of expectations that actually make a sense to your specific population of students, because those questions are often different depending on the age or even the discipline that your students are enrolled in. And then you have something very clear that you can produce for them without you having to communicate it after the fact. If you set that expectation up front, I think it is always much more successful than if you try to come in after the fact and talk to students about what was expected of you. They also kind of know that you're very invested in things when you're telling them beforehand. If you come in after the fact, they feel like you weren't really thinking ahead. You weren't setting the expectation for them to be very clear about what they needed to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I think it lends into some of the things that you talk about when it comes to instructor presence. Like if the instructor's coming in well after the fact when there's already a problem, instead of trying to create an environment ahead of time that would reduce the risk of some of that, it certainly creates some challenges. So would you be willing to speak a little bit on instructor presence?
Absolutely. So, when we talk about presence, particularly in the online classroom, what we're talking about are two key elements: telepresence, which is that sense of being there. So, you kind of feel like you're there, but social presence, and that's the sense of being together. So, when we bring presence together in the online classroom, not only do we feel like we're there, we feel like we're in the learning environment, we feel like we are there together. And that's really a key piece in promoting learner engagement. With learner engagement, they could be asking questions and seem curious, but only with you as the teacher. And we don't actually feel like we have a learning environment. And really, we need to create that learning environment, even if we're talking asynchronously. And so when we talk about things that help to promote presence, or the behaviors that we're looking at, not just people responding to discussion posts, but showing a depth of knowledge in those posts, and a depth of understanding. But you as the instructor need to be timely in what you're doing. And so this is where this kind of plays into what Michael was just saying, which is that we don't want to wait until after something's already happened.
Mhm.
We want to be there regularly. So we want to, kind of kick the course off with introducing ourselves. So as soon as someone arrives in the course, they have the introduction, they know what the expectations are for that course. Um, we're providing, consistent and meaningful replies, but not driving the conversation. And this is where it can get a little bit difficult as a teacher. You as an, faculty, instructor, teacher, trainer, what you want, what the crux of the answer is that you're looking for, and you often can taint the conversation by sort of driving it that way. But really, what you need to be is meaningful in your reply. So, how many of you have received oh, great job on your forum post? Well, what part of it was great? I can't replicate that and grow and continue to take that with me if you're not telling me what I've done well, just as equally as I'd like you to tell me the
Mhm.
things I need to improve on. And when you're present, you are able to actually dive in and get very specific about what was done well and what needs improvement. And your learners can do the same. And if you're modeling that type of behavior, they're more likely to do that as well when they're speaking with one another. So, you hear Michael and I, when we talk in these things, specifically call out certain things that the other has said because it's triggered something in our brain, in our thought process. And that's that feeling of being present. Michael and I are in two totally different states. We're rarely actually together in the same room, but we often feel like we're present when we are in these things or even in
Mhm.
meetings, because we do have, those elements of being very interested in what each other is saying, asking questions that continue the conversation and, demonstrate a deeper understanding, or we kind of go out and research information together. So when we have that presence piece, we all feel like we're working together. And there are a number of ways that we can do that. But ultimately, the key to know here, the reason this is so important is because your presence really drives what's going to happen in that course and the overall feeling that students have in it. So, pessimistic versus optimistic. If you think back to when you were going to school, you'd walk up to a classroom and you had a really grumpy teacher. No one wants to be in that course. Everyone is grumpy. There's nothing fun about it. You're there and you're just trying to get through it. But when you had that teacher who was there greeting people and giving great feedback, who seemed really passionate and present and involved, your own views and your own passion and presence changes. And so I think that even in an online course, we definitely need to make sure that we are being present. We're engaging with those students in a different way. We're, showing our passion needs to show through. And Michael talked a little bit about multimedia a little while ago, and we tend to rely pretty heavily on video right now in online courses. Um, and everyone feels like that video has to be perfect. So it's super scripted. Everyone can tell you're reading. There are no
Mhm.
mistakes. It actually makes you a little less relatable to your students. So occasionally you'll be a dog who walks behind me in my video, or
Mhm.
I'll stumble over a word and not re-record that section because it's more relatable. Students feel like I was really
Mhm.
there, and they can sense my passion when I let it come through in those videos. And all of those things help to bring that presence that we need to create that learning environment.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I love that these ideas start to blend together the more you look at them. Like video is a great way to incorporate presence in the course, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Like I guarantee your students are probably regularly engaging with video through Instagram Reels, through TikTok, through YouTube, and YouTube Shorts. So they're very accustomed to not only engaging with video, but video that is not professionally produced, video that is good enough, right? Like perfect is the enemy of good, and it does not have to be perfect. To Amy's point, several years ago at a previous job, I was helping some instructors build content for a fully online course. And the instructor had started to record a lecture that included talking heads, so them on webcam along with their slides on the screen. And at one point, their dog hopped up onto their lap mid recording, and she had come to me and said, "Can you edit this out?" And I said, "Absolutely not. We're absolutely leaving this in." Because it's very endearing. And it was. The students loved it. That was one of their favorite videos, purely because of the dog showing up. They kept requesting that the dog would come to future screencasts. And some of the students actually mentioned it on the course evaluations, which I thought was very funny. So,
Mhm.
those little moments of imperfection are very humanizing and endearing and comforting. And I would encourage folks to think like there is a difference between professionally produced video and having a presence that does not feel like you are so stilted and stuffy that you're not a relatable person anymore. So I really do love that. In terms of some more applicable strategies that folks could look at, to change gears a little bit, one of my favorite frameworks for trying to find ways to make content more engaging for learners is through the lens of gamification, because there are so many different little strategies in there that can be applied really easily and in a wide variety of ways that it's a very broad framework, I think. So sometimes people hear gamification and it's like, oh, I have to turn my course into a game. Not what we're saying at all. Not what we're saying at all. Within games and game systems, there are a lot of different ideas and strategies that we can just pull out and apply really quickly to an educational learning environment that can have a really big impact on how engaged or how interested learners are in course content. Now, some of that is stuff that like I personally don't get into very much, like leaderboards in the course, like who's got the highest score, who's
Mhm.
earned the most points for engaging in forums and turning work in early and things like that. But there are also some folks who, in the corporate environment, want to earn a badge so they can post it on their LinkedIn profile and point to that, with their employer at their annual review when they say, "Hey, I think I deserve a raise. And, here are all these badges that I've earned from my professional development." There are other really simple strategies that you could use that I think reframe the educational environment for students in a way that's really meaningful, but also really simple to implement. And one of my favorite go-to examples, Amy's heard me say this so much, is you can edit in Moodle your grade letters on a course by course basis. And what you could do is instead of having it be A through F, you could actually rename those to different levels. Like, it could be like expert, intermediate. You could even borrow from like oh, it's on the verge of it's on the very tip of my brain. Apprenticeship style
Yeah.
approaches like that you see with electricians and plumbers, right? You can borrow the same levels of proficiency there, like journeyman. I can't think of any more right now, but you get the general idea where you could progress
Mhm.
through these. And what I would say is then switch the grading process around so that everyone starts with a 0. Like in natural grading in Moodle, you can actually set it up to count empty grades, so grades where there's just no grade, as a 0. So everybody starts with a 0, and then they
Mhm.
work their way up the grade scale. If you did that with grade letters, everyone would start with an F and panic for over half the semester until they got a little bit higher. But what you could do is rechange your scale. You can set up your own percentages there. So maybe once they get to 10% of the course grade, they move to a new level, right? That would probably be one of
Mhm.
the simplest implementations of it. And they are now focused on improvement and working their way up rather than trying to preserve losses, which is how our current grading system works. Like our current grading system, if we really think about it, it is based around preservation of loss. And the students start with
Mhm.
100 and they can only ever lose points throughout the semester. But if you switch around to a gamification model, which is always based around growth and leveling up, right?
Mhm.
You start with a 0 and you work your way up to expertise within that subject. That's one of the simplest things you can do. It's an idea borrowed straight from role playing games, even tabletop games like Dungeons and Dragons and things like
Mhm.
that, where there's a leveling system that you improve as you do more things and learn more things. And it could easily be incorporated into any course to change how the students look at their learning and look at their improvement and their engagement within the course. So I really do love gamification as a framework. There's just a lot of different ideas that we can pull from there. And one of the cool things about that is very often in those systems, you get feedback right away to your
Right.
actions. So you
Mhm.
get a result from your actions, even if it's like a little badge or like a little message or something like that. And that feedback can be really really important. And Amy, I know you talk a lot about feedback and how valuable that is for instructors and for students, right? When they're trying to learn how they're doing.
Exactly. And it's, the numeric value of climbing up a scale is feedback in and of itself, right? So it's kind of an instantaneous bit, but it's feedback that tells you where you are. So it's a numeric feedback, I did well or I didn't do well, but what we really need to make sure that we're doing with our students or our trainees or even each other is providing timely feedback. And this is something that we have been working hard to implement here internally because that feedback does matter. So we have an internal channel in our comms area where we share feedback that we hear about each other or want to give one another in a timely way, and it really makes a difference. So if someone did something amazing this morning and a client commented on it, we post it right away because it matters in the moment, and right then and there what you did well, and that's something you should carry forward. And the same goes when we're teaching courses. Feedback really needs to be timely and specific. So there's really nothing more annoying than when students post in a forum and they all say, "I agree with you. That's a great point," right? As people who teach, that drives you insane. Students feel the same thing when you say, "Great job. Well done. Nice work. Keep it up," but you don't give them any meat in that feedback. And so when we think about feedback, there's a variety of ways to leave that. It could be written, but as we talked about early on, just writing everything, text-based everything, no one's really interested in that, right? Like everyone wants the too long didn't read version of things. So you could be leaving short video snippets of feedback, an audio snippet of feedback. In my current program at school, I'm connected with my the chair of my committee on WhatsApp, and he just sends voice notes, lets me know what's going well, what I need to change, and then I can hear his intonation, I can hear his mood in there, and now the feedback makes more sense to me. I understand it better. I know,
Mhm.
I'm not reading it in the tone. Maybe I'm in a bad mood and I read feedback and I think this person's being hypercritical of me. So, taking into account the fact that leaving feedback in a variety of ways, multimedia feedback is
Mhm.
fantastic. Short video snippet, short audio snippet, something written. Sometimes I do emojis. I'll send my students a message, or even my forum reply will be an emoji or an image that just kind of conveys what I'm thinking about and gives them some feedback
Mhm.
with something very specific. These are really key when it comes to promoting learner engagement. If I think someone says, if the feedback I receive is great job, keep it up, you had APA violations, I don't think someone actually read my work. So why would I be engaged in this course if I feel like that teacher is not engaged in the course? They're clearly not reading my work. Otherwise, they would leave me better feedback. So keeping that in
Mhm.
mind, when you're leaving that feedback, you want to be timely, you want to be specific, call out something that they did really well so the students know what to do, that that's something they should continue to do. If they need to improve something, give something very specific about what they need to improve. I mentioned APA, so perhaps the thing that they need to improve upon there is that when they have more than two authors, I think it is now in the newest version of APA, they can do the first reference as an et al, which is different than it was before. Being that specific is very important. Feedback is the opportunity to learn. We don't learn just from the content, we learn from the feedback and the environment around us. And so making sure that we're being prescriptive and intentional with our feedback is really important in terms of promoting learner engagement.
Yeah, I absolutely agree because I worry that a lot of students, especially in, let's say, like education contexts, look at learning as I have accomplished the task. Like I turned in the paper, I made the forum post, I completed the quiz, and skipping over that feedback piece because the feedback piece is where a lot of the learning comes in. The
Mhm,
assessment's usually where the learning is. You're attempting to demonstrate what you know. That feedback is professional feedback on how you did, how you performed, and areas where you are really thriving and areas where you could use some work. And it's really essential, but you're right. A lot of students don't seem to engage with it right now because there seems to be this conception that, like, I checked the box, I did the
right.
thing, so I'm done, and moving
Mhm,
away from feedback. So finding new ways to incorporate that with learners. And the interesting thing about feedback is it's probably one of the most time consuming tasks for instructors, but it's one of the most powerful that they can engage with for their
mhm,
learners. And it is possible, if you can find the time to invest, to build a lot of this ahead of time. We talk about you can build literally question by question level feedback on questions within a quiz. You can use a marking guide slash grading guide, depending on which region you're in. It's the exact same feature, just called something different,
mhm,
as a feedback tool for assignments, and use that to save your most frequently used comments that you have on your assignments that you collect so that you can rapidly just paste in high quality feedback that you've already written, right?
mhm.
And it does take time to prepare some of this and do that prep work. But once it's done, what that means is your students are getting feedback from you, but they're getting it faster, right? They're getting it on a timely basis, like you were talking about. So I know that this is a time consuming thing to ask folks to do, but the payoff, the return on investment for providing high quality feedback to students is just off the charts. It's one of the most important things that you can do as an instructor. And being able to take the work that you've already done, the feedback you've already created in the past for other learners, and being able to repurpose that in simple, meaningful ways, like in your question construction or in marking guides and grading guides. I think it's a fantastic application. But aside from instructor time being a huge challenge when it comes to providing timely and accurate feedback, what are some of the other challenges that you think people might run into when they're trying to create more engaging experiences?
Yeah, so I think, obviously feedback is always the more difficult one. I do like to create a bit of a feedback library that give me some of the prompts that I like to use. But I think that in terms of other challenges, poor course design is probably at the very top. And I think that we are in a period right now where people are recognizing that we had kind of an emergency situation 3 years ago where courses that typically weren't offered online and didn't already have some setup there were moved online, and people just put as much content in as they could. Or we're just in a place where we had been building courses and over the last 3 years have not had the opportunity to redesign those courses. Poor course design leads to frustration, and frustration is the enemy of engagement. When you are frustrated, it is very difficult to get engaged. I was away last week, and I met this couple out while I was just walking around, and they asked what I did, and I told them, and the gentleman started to talk to me about how frustrating trying to use his online banking app was, to the point that now he just doesn't use it. And I thought this is perfect example of what we go through every single day, where people have questions, what do we do now to redesign these courses? And so I think poor course design is one of the biggest challenges that we're facing right now. And there are definitely ways that we can, you know, redesign courses, not lose the content, not lose the meat of the course, but make it much easier to navigate. There are certain course formats that let us do this. There are ways to put together collections of information so they're easier to navigate. I kind of My analogy for this is when you walk into a new grocery store for the first time and it is arranged in a totally different way than the grocery store that you typically go to, extremely frustrating. You thought you were going to come in, it would make sense that the produce is right here, and now all of a sudden it's something totally different. It is frustrating, it's time consuming to learn something and to figure out where things are. So being very cautious about your course design, reaching out to people who do course design or who have ideas about course design, joining a community, a group on our Open LMS community, which is open to everyone, whether you're a client with us or not, is a great place to start talking about things like that and creating kind of these communities of practice where we can work on things like that. Um, there are uh, lots of things that I think are challenges. And Michael, you talked about bringing in that multimedia. So, maybe you want to talk a little bit about. I'll ask you to talk a little bit about, when there's not interactivity in a course and how challenging that can be.
Yeah, absolutely. Without that interactivity piece, it starts to feel a little bit more like a correspondence course. And it's not that correspondence courses can't be successful. I mean, they worked pretty well in the 70s and 80s, right? But they're not everyone's going to do well in that type of a learning environment. Like you have to have a very high level of motivation to overcome the structure of the course in that particular case. And not only that, everyone that I've run into from education to corporate to nonprofit to an independent organization, the work that they're doing is interesting and meaningful. And a lot of people talk about it. It's just impossible to me that there would not be alternative forms of media to incorporate into your course, be it a video, an audio recording, interactive activities, like even something as simple as an H5P image hotspot activity that lets you layer additional content and context over top of an image,
Mhm.
which is pretty easy to put together. It takes about 5 minutes to learn to do that, and it can dramatically improve an otherwise passive image, which, albeit is very visual and very helpful for communicating complex ideas, but you can now layer additional context over top of that and provide even more value that requires the students to directly interact with that thing to do well. And honestly, when I think about some of the challenges that come along with finding engagement and building engaging learning experiences, it's sort of like the opposite of everything that we've talked about up to this point, right? Like, don't provide feedback or don't provide feedback in a timely manner. Don't provide opportunities to interact with other people in the course. Don't provide interactive elements within your content. Keep everything pretty repetitive and static and just very text heavy and things like that. And it's just it 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 kind of drives a level of boredom that makes it difficult to engage with the content. At that point, your learners are sort of like, how do I get through this? What's my survival mode? Rather than getting into the content and finding different methods and methodologies to get through everything. And I think Katie's naturally bringing up a really great point along these lines, because if we're
Absolutely.
talking about incorporating multimedia, how do we do that in a way that's accessible? So this is hard to talk about because Amy and I already operate on an assumption where we're building content that's going to be accessible by default.
Mhm.
So our videos are all transcribed so that they are captioned correct. And then we have the full blown transcripts that we can provide to folks. We've got image descriptions, but if we are using an image, we usually have an alternative description that would also cover it via text. We try and provide things via audio form sometimes, depending on learner needs. And we don't use any H5P activities that aren't fully accessible. So even if someone has, let's say, a mobility impairment, and they can only navigate with a keyboard. So we want to make sure that things like the image hotspots activities are fully accessible, which they are.
Mhm.
But it even extends beyond that, because the majority of impairments that you see in, let's say, the educational world where they're tracked are learning impairments and
Mhm.
emotional disorders, or things like depression, anxiety, ADHD. And so one thing that we also do is, it's not just the type of content, but how you structure your
Right.
content, breaking it up
Mhm.
into meaningful pieces that people can pick up and drop at sort of short notice if they need to. So they can, it's sort of like a book, a book that's not broken up into chapters is going to be really difficult to read. So, if you're reading a book, you might stop at the end of a chapter and then come back to it later. Totally normal thing to do. Or you might just tear through the whole thing at once. And we take a similar approach to course design to have those meaningful breaks for learners, just to make sure that we're ensuring that everything is as accessible as possible. I would also say when it extends to assessment, you want to be realistic about the assessments that you're requiring for your learners. So, like Amy was saying earlier, if you have those discussion forums and it's like, what's 2 plus 2, and Katie replies and says, after some rigorous research, 2 plus 2 equals 4. And I reply to Katie because I'm required to reply. I can be like, Katie, that was such a good example of how 2 and 2 equals 4. I really love how, you had the 2 over here and there was a 2 over here and you put them together and now it's 4. Brilliant work. And it's not really meaningful interaction between the two of us because the prompt is off. It's really just sort of fill in the blanks. It's not really sparking discussion. So some of those things are really, really tricky when it comes to assessment. I still remember, I would never say anything bad about a course designer. I will say I saw one course where there were 137 quizzes in a semester-long course. And all I will say about that is there's a difference between rigor and there's a difference between punishment. And I think it went far over that line.
Yeah. Yep. And I think that's a good point. And actually, I think that would make a totally different chat where we talk about how do we make a content-rich course that actually isn't just punishment. It's not just things for the sake of having things in there. This is a question that comes up pretty regularly. And I think we could talk, a whole 45 minutes on what does it look like when we have a course that is both rigorous and content rich, but not just filled with things for the sake of trying to make up seat time. And that's where one of the balances to engaging learners comes in.
Absolutely. And I was going to put this in the chat, but I'll just say it out loud, just for the record, so I don't miss it with the accessibility piece. All of the Open LMS Academy courses, we don't put anything out until we get all zeros with the Brickfield Labs accessibility toolkit. Brickfield Labs is a great partner of ours. We love working with Gavin over there. We love working with Brickfield. And so we make sure that we have the accessibility block in every course that we offer. And we make sure that we've basically fixed every single error that it might find, to the point where now when we're building, like, we open up the block and it does the review and it's just all zeros. And we're like, yes, this is fantastic. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that later this month. Maddie just put the link in the chat there. We're going to have a Global Accessibility Awareness Day event on May 18th. And it's a simulcast across multiple regions. So if you're tuning in from Asia or Australia right now, or Europe or Latin America, we are going to have multiple sessions, 4 sessions running that day in time zones that work well for you. And if English is a second or third or fourth language and Spanish is your first, we'll actually have a Spanish simulcast. So that will be going on again May 18th. If you want to sign up for that, the link is going to be in the chat. So, all
right, great. Well, I think that about wraps us up for today. I hope that we see many of you at our Global Accessibility Day. Please do share that link on LinkedIn. We'd love to have lots of people there. Accessibility is something that's truly important in a passion of both Michael and I, something that we strive for and we try to promote and help others with. So be sure to share that, and hopefully we will see you there. And thanks for joining us today, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.